Welcome back to This Week in Texas. I'm joined now by Professor of Constitutional Law at the South Texas College of Law, Josh Blackman. Thanks for joining us, Professor Blackman. We're talking about Merrill versus Milligan. It's a voting rights case out of Alabama. It's before the Supreme Court right now. Tell our viewers what specifically it's about and how it could impact redistricting maps and representation all over the country.
Sure. The Voting Rights Act was enacted in the 1960s. And the purpose of this law was to make it harder for states to dilute the votes of minority voters. For many years, entire portions of the country were subject to what's known as a pre-clearance process. Well, that means if, let's say, Texas wanted to make any changes to their voting rules, Texas would need permission of the Department of Justice or ask permission of a federal court in Washington, D.C. That was the rule for about 50 odd years. But the Supreme Court decided that policy was unconstitutional in a case called Shelby County v. Holder. This case said that this pre-clearance process was based on outdated maps and outdated coverage formulas. That is, even if a state might have had issues in the 1960s, those formulas need to be updated. So the Shelby County case threw out this pre-clearance process for the most part. And since then, Congress has not updated the coverage maps. So therefore, that portion of the Voting Rights Act basically has no effect anymore. Instead, after Shelby County, litigants turned to another provision of the Voting Rights Act known as Section 2. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is a little bit different. Section 2 requires a showing that when a government drew a map, there had to be intentional discrimination. That is, the government intended to discriminate against a minority group on the basis of race, for example. And that's what brings us to the Milligan case. Alabama drew a series of maps. Various African-American groups in the state argued that the maps diluted the votes of Black voters and that this was intentional discrimination. And this is the issue the Supreme Court has to decide this year.
And how might that affect a state like Texas, for example, where we now have 38 seats, 2 new seats, and neither of those seats necessarily represent the growth in, say, the Hispanic population in the state of Texas?
Right. I think so. There are 2 related issues, right? One, what does it take to show intentional discrimination? Does there have to be some sort of clear statement in the record saying, we are drawing these maps to dilute the votes of Hispanic voters? You're not going to find that, at least when someone makes a big mistake. Right. The more likely way of proving discrimination is sort of indirectly. That is, if you look at the growth in minority group populations in the state, yet their representation is going the opposite direction, is going down, there might be an indication this was done to reduce or dilute the votes. Alabama made an argument that was very aggressive. Alabama argued that their maps were drawn race blind, that is, without regard to race. They were drawn independent of race. And some of the more liberal justices in the court said, wait a minute, you need to consider race when you're drawing maps to avoid discriminating. So there are 2 very different approaches. Do you draw maps without any regard to race, or do you draw maps precisely to protect what's called a majority-minority voting district, that is, where the majority of people in the district are of a racial minority?
And so, depending on how the Supreme Court rules in Merrill versus Milligan, it could have ripple effects across the country as we look at redistricting maps and so many lawsuits associated with those maps, many of them here in Texas.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I can give you a preview of what will likely happen. In February, 5 members of the Supreme Court said the Alabama maps are okay on a temporary basis. So in the upcoming election, the 2022 midterm elections, the challenge maps will be in effect. Usually, when the Supreme Court lets them go into effect temporarily, that's a signal that the Supreme Court will allow the law to go into effect permanently later. Also, having reviewed the oral arguments from last week, it seems the Supreme Court will be okay with what Alabama did. The only question is, what's the standard they use? I think the Supreme Court will reject Alabama's argument that they need to have complete race neutrality. That's unlikely. But far more likely is that the government will have to show, is this sort of a reasonable map that a neutral map drawer would have come up with? And if it is, then it'll pass constitutional muster. So I think the Section 2 challenge, is this challenge based on intentional discrimination, will be weakened by the court. I think that should give more latitude to a state like Texas to draw maps, even if representation for certain minority groups is diluted.
Certainly significant. We appreciate your time, Professor Blackman, as always, an expert in constitutional law. And This Week in Texas, we'll be right back.